A black man walks into one of the most exclusive luxury restaurants in New York. Dressed sharp and confident, ready to enjoy an evening out. But when he approaches the hostess stand, things take a turn. She looks him up and down, then politely tells him the restaurant is fully booked. He can see the empty tables behind her. Moments later, a waiter whispers just loud enough for him to hear, "We can't have this kind of element tonight." Humiliated but calm, the man quietly steps out. 7 minutes later, the entire restaurant staff is left speechless. What they didn't know, that man wasn't just anyone, he was the new owner. What happened next turned Maison Royale upside down and sparked a change no one expected. Stay with me, because this is a story that needs to be told. Before we jump in, let me know where you're watching from. And if you believe in stories that challenge injustice, don't forget to like and subscribe. David Monroe stood before the grand entrance of Maison Royale, its facade glowing gold in the last light of day. The restaurant seemed to exist outside of time, as though the heavy oak doors led not to a dining hall but to another world, one where money whispered louder than names, and legacy held more weight than merit. David lingered a moment longer on the steps, adjusting his cufflinks though they sat perfectly in place. The collar of his navy blue jacket caught the breeze, and for an instant, he could feel the familiar pull of the past. Harlem summers, the weight of his mother's hand on his shoulder, and the scratch of second-hand ties borrowed for church. Those memories rose unbidden, as if to remind him how far he had come, or perhaps how little distance there truly was between then and now. At 45, David was not a man who often felt out of place. He had long since shed the skin of that quiet boy from uptown, shaping himself into something that could not be ignored. His tech company, Monroe Systems, had become the crown jewel of the AI market, its algorithms used in everything from Wall Street trading floors to hospital diagnostic tools. Articles called him a visionary, a genius, some even whispered billionaire. But no amount of success could smooth the sharp edges of a world that had already decided where he belonged. Stepping forward, David opened the heavy glass door and let its weight pull him inside. The lobby was an expanse of marble and crystal, the chandeliers hanging like frost suspended mid-fall. There was a hush to the room, the kind cultivated over centuries in places that cater to the unshakably privileged. At the hostess stand stood a woman whose presence seemed tailored to fit this place. She was tall, blonde, and still in the way that only certain people can be, like a statue at rest. Her smile, polished and polite, did not falter as David approached, but he saw the flicker in her eyes, brief as a shadow passing behind glass. "Good evening," she greeted, her tone crisp but pleasant. "Do you have a reservation, sir?" David met her gaze with a warm, easy smile. "I'm afraid not," he replied. "I was hoping you might have a table available for one." Her lips tightened, not visibly, not in any way most would notice. But David had learned long ago to read the language of dismissal. It was in the subtle tilt of her head, the way her eyes flicked over his face as if searching for something. Some proof, perhaps, that he truly belonged here. "I'm terribly sorry," she said smoothly, returning to the safety of her script. "We're fully booked this evening." David let his eyes drift past her, toward the dining room visible through the arched doorway behind her shoulder. White linen stretched across tables. Crystal glasses stood untouched. Empty chairs, at least half a dozen, sat in quiet defiance of her claim. His smile did not waver. "I see a few open tables," he said gently. "Surely you can make room for one more guest." Her practiced mask did not slip, but there was no mistaking the coolness that settled over her features. "I'm afraid those tables are reserved," she replied, her words sharper now, like the edge of a thin blade. "Perhaps you'd like to try one of the other restaurants down the block. I'm sure they'd be more accommodating." That word, accommodating. It was the gentlest of slaps delivered with the precision of someone who had no intention of acknowledging it as such. David felt the familiar heat rise in his chest, the kind that came not from the words themselves, but from the knowledge that they were meant for him. It was not anger, not yet. It was the slow simmer of recognition. He had seen this before. In boardrooms, at charity galas, on golf courses where men twice his age insisted he must be someone's caddy. A voice spoke from behind the hostess stand. "Is there a problem here, Clarissa?" David turned slightly as a waiter approached, older than the hostess but with the same air of studied refinement. The man's eyes flicked to David, and his lips pressed thin. "We can't have this sort of element disrupting the experience for our other guests," the waiter said quietly, but not so quietly that David couldn't hear. There it was. That was the thing about this kind of prejudice, it was rarely loud. Rarely reckless. It did not announce itself with slurs or shouting. It wore silk ties and understated suits. It whispered, smooth and polite, behind marble counters and beneath gilded chandeliers. David considered his options. He could pull out his phone. One call to the right person, and this waiter would be out of a job by morning. He had the connections. But what then? Another waiter would take his place. Another hostess would stand at this podium. The marble floors would remain untouched. And he would walk out of this restaurant the same way he had walked in, an outsider. Looking in. Instead, David exhaled softly, squaring his shoulders. "No problem at all," he said, his voice even. "Thank you for your time." He turned, catching his reflection in the brass-framed mirror by the door. There he was, the boy from Harlem. The tech mogul. The man who owned 3 penthouses and a yacht he rarely used. But beyond all of that, he was something more. David Monroe did not need their table. As he stepped back into the cool New York night, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he would buy the whole damn restaurant. David Monroe didn't walk fast. There was no rush, no frantic search for another restaurant. He wasn't hungry, not for food. Anyway, hunger had never been the issue. The sidewalk pulsed beneath the hum of the city's evening shift. Couples drifted past, wrapped in the bubble of their conversations, their laughter drifting into the cool air. Cabs slid by in streaks of yellow, their headlights flicking across his face, catching the slight furrow in his brow. The slight wasn't new. David had learned to carry these moments the way other men carried pocket squares tucked away. Rarely used but always there when needed. He had lived long enough to know the weight of being black in spaces that weren't made for him. Maison Royale had simply reminded him of what he already knew. As he walked, David let his mind drift backward, peeling away the years with the ease of turning pages in a book. He was 16 again, sitting in the guidance counselor's office at Harlem High. She was kind, but kindness didn't stop her from suggesting trade school, politely guiding him toward electrician work instead of the computer engineering programs he'd been eyeing. "Maybe something more practical," she'd said, her voice wrapped in soft wool, as though she were doing him a favor. At 22, David had walked into the tech startup where he interned, only to be asked 3 times if he was there to fix the Wi-Fi. He was 27 when a potential investor glanced over his pitch deck and said, "You've got the brains, clearly, but we'll need to put someone else in the room when it comes time to close deals." Just optics. You understand. David understood. He always understood. But understanding didn't soften the edges of the world he lived in. By the time David reached the corner of 5th Avenue, the fire inside him had settled, not extinguished, but tempered, as if the wind had shaped it into something sharper. A Bentley idled by the curb. Eric Reese leaned against the car, watching him approach with the ease of a man who had seen this scene unfold too many times. Eric, his closest friend since college, was used to waiting for David after board meetings, after charity dinners. He was also used to seeing that familiar expression on his friend's face. "Let me guess," Eric said, opening the car door for him. "Reservation problems?" David slid into the passenger seat, letting out a long breath as Eric joined him on the driver's side. "I counted 8 empty tables," David replied, his voice calm. "Maybe 9. Eric's low chuckle filled the car. Classic. They didn't need to say more. As the Bentley rolled forward, David watched the skyline through the glass, the sprawl of the city stretching into the darkening sky. It was strange, this feeling, even after everything, after the IPOs, the Forbes covers, the invitations to rub elbows with titans. There were still spaces where the lock never seemed to fit his key. "It's funny," David mused after a while. "No matter how much money you make, you can't buy your way out of being black in America." Eric's eyes stayed on the road, but his grip on the wheel tightened slightly. "They let you in just far enough to take your money," Eric said, "but not far enough to let you forget who you are." David nodded. The unspoken part of that sentence hung between them, because they won't let you forget. Silence stretched between the two men until David shifted in his seat. The flicker of an idea taking shape. "What if we bought the place?" Eric's head whipped around, his eyebrows raising in disbelief. "Maison Royale?" David shrugged. the corners of his mouth curling slightly. Why not? Eric let out a short laugh. Man, you really know how to hold a grudge. It's not a grudge, David corrected. It's about making sure the next David Monroe doesn't stand at that podium, waiting for a table that will never open up. Eric was quiet for a long moment, mulling it over. I get it, Eric said finally. But buying a place like that, that's not just real estate. It's generational. The people who run Maison Royale have been doing this since their great-grandfathers were smoking cigars in French parlors. David's eyes narrowed slightly as he leaned back in his seat. Then it's about time someone changed that. Eric chuckled again, but this time, there was something else beneath it, a note of respect. Maybe even curiosity. All right, Eric said with a smirk. Let's see what their price tag looks like. A week later, David found himself in Maison Royale's private dining room, not as a guest, but as a potential buyer. The owner sat across from him, a man named Philippe Lassalle, whose salt and pepper hair and tailored three-piece suit spoke to the kind of wealth that didn't blink at a $900 bottle of Bordeaux. Philippe's handshake was brief. Cool, Mr. Monroe, Philippe greeted, though there was something detached in the way he said David's name. Like it was an accessory to be acknowledged but not necessarily respected. Mr. Lassalle, David replied smoothly, taking his seat. The negotiation was polite, as these things often were. But beneath the pleasantries, David could feel the tension running through the room like an electric current. Maison Royale was not a failing business. But David had done his research. The profits were thinning. The younger generation of elite diners was flocking to trendier, more inclusive spaces. And Philippe's grip on this particular empire was beginning to slip. David could see it in the way Philippe's fingers drummed absently against the tablecloth. How curious, Philippe said, sipping his wine. Most of our buyers are different. David held Philippe's gaze, unflinching. Different how? Philippe smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Younger, he said, eyes lingering just long enough to convey the words he didn't say aloud. David leaned forward, his own smile easy but razor sharp. Younger doesn't mean unqualified, Mr. Lassalle. It just means I'll be around long enough to see this place become something better than what it is now. Philippe's smile faded slightly, and David knew he had struck the right chord. It wasn't about revenge. It was about rewriting the rules of the game. The deal was done with a handshake that felt more like a dismissal. Philippe Lassalle's grip lingered just long enough for David Monroe to feel the weight of it, a gesture that carried no congratulations, no goodwill. It was the grip of a man who had sold the family estate but left the front gate key under the mat. Philippe's lips pressed into a thin line, his blue eyes studying David with something that rested uneasily between curiosity and disdain. David had encountered this look before. It was not the open hostility of men who raised their voices and pointed fingers. This was something colder, quieter, a subtle, persistent disbelief that no amount of wealth could shake loose. Well, Mr. Monroe, Philippe said, releasing his hand, Maison Royale is yours. The dining room fell silent after those words, as if the walls themselves recoiled at the idea. David could almost hear the echo of past patrons, men like Philippe's father and grandfather, laughing over imported scotch. Secure in the knowledge that this space belonged to them, David didn't bother to smile. Thank you, Mr. Lassalle, he said, his tone smooth, polite, and unyielding. I'll take good care of it. Philippe nodded once but said nothing more. Instead, he slipped on his coat with an air of finality. There was no small talk, no lingering over dessert. Philippe left as though he were exiting the scene of a crime. And David understood why. To Philippe, Maison Royale's sale was not a business decision. It was an inheritance lost to time, to circumstance, and to a black man who did not belong in the photo albums lining the Lassalle family mantelpiece. By the time David stepped outside, the evening air had sharpened. The autumn wind pressed against his skin, and the city unfolded before him, bright and indifferent. Eric was waiting by the Bentley, leaning casually against the door. His arms were crossed, and he raised an eyebrow the moment David approached. How'd it go? Eric asked, but David could already see that he knew the answer. David exhaled slowly, his breath curling into the night. It's mine. Eric let out a low whistle. Just like that? David smirked. Not exactly. He sold it to me. But he didn't think I deserved it. Eric chuckled, shaking his head. They never do. David opened the passenger door but hesitated, his eyes flicking back toward the restaurant's facade. Maison Royale still loomed behind him, its gilded entrance reflecting the streetlights like a monument to something that refused to die. As the wind pressed against his back, David could feel the weight of history settling over him. It was not the history taught in textbooks, not the neat, linear story of progress and perseverance. This was something messier. It was the history of doors that had been slammed shut, of tables where his seat was never pulled out, and of men like Philippe Lassalle who offered handshakes as if they were doing him a favor. David's fingers curled around the car door, tightening. Eric noticed. "What is it?" David's eyes stayed fixed on the restaurant. "You ever feel like winning isn't enough?" Eric tilted his head. "You mean like buying this place?" David nodded. "I thought buying it would feel like something. But all I feel is." He let the words hang in the air. Eric's gaze followed David's line of sight to the restaurant. After a long pause, he said quietly, "Because you know that restaurant wasn't built for us." David finally looked away from the building, turning toward Eric. "No," David said, "but I'm going to rebuild it for everyone else." The next day, David walked into Maison Royale not as a guest but as its owner. The staff stood in clusters by the bar, their eyes shifting toward him with varying degrees of surprise and discomfort. Clarissa, the hostess who had turned him away weeks earlier, straightened visibly behind the podium, her practiced smile flickering when she recognized him. David didn't address it, not yet. Instead, he took his time, letting his footsteps echo across the marble floors as he absorbed every detail: the chandeliers, the faint hum of classical music, the paintings that lined the walls. It was a beautiful space, but beauty alone had never been enough to make David feel welcome. By the time he reached the center of the dining room, David turned to face the staff, hands clasped in front of him. "I know some of you recognize me," he began, his voice carrying softly but firmly across the room. "I was here a few weeks ago. I didn't have a reservation." A few glances shifted toward Clarissa, whose face flushed pink, but David pressed on without acknowledging her. "That's not why I bought this place," David continued. "I didn't buy it to settle a score. I bought it because I believe Maison Royale can be something more than what it's been." He let the words linger, letting their meaning take root. "There's a lot of history in this building," David said, his gaze sweeping across the room. "But history doesn't feed people. It doesn't keep doors open. What we do from this point forward, that's the legacy we're going to build." Silence held the room like a held breath. Finally, David met their eyes again, softer this time. "Those of you who want to be part of that future, I'd love for you to stay. If you don't, I understand." Clarissa shifted behind the podium, her shoulders stiffened, as if expecting reprimand, but David only nodded toward her, his expression unreadable. "I believe in second chances," David said, holding her gaze for a moment longer before turning away. He walked toward the far end of the restaurant, already envisioning the changes he would make. A new menu, a new chef, new faces, and old ones if they were willing to see what this place could become. Behind him, Eric leaned against the bar, shaking his head with a grin. "Man," Eric said quietly, "I think Philippe just realized he sold this place to the wrong guy." David's smile was small, but there was no mistaking the steel beneath it. "No," David replied, "he sold it to the right one." David Monroe expected resistance. The thing about old institutions was that they did not crumble loudly. They did not fight you at the gates or announce their grievances with banners and chants. No, the kind of resistance Maison Royale harbored was the kind that whispered behind closed doors, lurking in the glances exchanged between waiters and the fleeting smirks of the old guard. David first felt it in the small things. The delay in returning his emails when he requested staffing reports. The kitchen's sudden, supply chain issues that somehow coincided with his plans to introduce a new chef. The way some of the senior waiters referred to him not as Mr. Monroe, but with the casualness of David, as if the boundary between owner and employee could be blurred when the owner looked like him. At first, David ignored it. These were the final twitches of an establishment unwilling to accept that the ground beneath it had shifted. David told himself it would pass after all. Money had changed hands. The deed to Maison Royale was his. What more could they do? But institutions like Maison Royale weren't just built on money. They were built on allegiance, on a silent understanding passed from one generation to the next. The restaurant was Philippe Lassalle's by birthright. and to the staff. David was a guest overstaying his welcome. One morning, David arrived to find Chef Mark, the head of the kitchen for over 15 years, standing outside the entrance smoking a cigarette. His white apron hung loosely around his waist, and the faint smell of garlic clung to him. "Morning," David said, stepping past him toward the door. Mark's eyes flicked toward him, but the chef didn't return the greeting. Inside, the smell of burned coffee greeted David like a warning. The staff moved quietly, as if rehearsing lines for a play David wasn't invited to join. It wasn't what they said but what they withheld, the way conversations tapered off when he entered the room. Eric, standing by the bar, watched this happen for the third time that week. His brow furrowed as he leaned in. "You see this, right?" Eric whispered. David nodded slightly, but his gaze stayed fixed on the dining room floor. "It's fine," David said. "They'll adjust." Eric let out a low breath. "Man, I don't know. This isn't adjusting. This is sabotage wrapped in good manners." David knew Eric wasn't wrong. A week later, David found himself standing in the middle of the kitchen. Mark had called a staff meeting to discuss concerns about the menu changes David proposed. The concern, as it turned out, wasn't about the food. "It's tradition," Mark said, his arms crossed as he leaned against the stainless steel counter. "Maison Royale's guests expect a certain experience. You start messing with that, you risk losing them." David stood still, letting Mark's words sit between them. The other kitchen staff watched, exchanging glances but saying nothing. "We're not losing guests because of the food," David replied calmly. "We're losing them because the world is changing and we aren't." Mark chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "Maybe it's changing, but the people who come here," he paused, searching for the right words, "they like things the way they are. It's not personal." David smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You mean they like things the way they were?" Mark's gaze hardened slightly. "Call it what you want." David nodded slowly. "I'll call it what it is," David said. "Exclusion. And I'm not interested in preserving that." The kitchen fell silent, the weight of his words hanging between them. David could feel the quiet challenge in the air, the kind of challenge that wouldn't be met with shouting or argument. No, the pushback would come in small ways. Late orders, dishes mysteriously not arriving on time. Mark shrugged after a long pause. "It's your place now," he said, pushing off the counter and walking away. But David caught something in the man's eyes before he turned. It wasn't fear, it was resignation. Mark wasn't just fighting to keep Maison Royale's old ways, he was fighting to hold on to the world he knew. A world where men like David didn't own places like this. That evening, David sat across from Eric in his penthouse, a glass of scotch resting in his hand. The city sprawled beneath them, the lights of Manhattan glowing like scattered embers. Eric broke the silence first. "So, when are you firing him?" David swirled the glass slowly, watching the liquid catch the light. "I'm not." Eric frowned. "David, the man practically told you to your face that he's not on board." David took a long sip, setting the glass down gently. "I know," David said, "but this isn't about Mark. It's bigger than him." Eric's eyes narrowed slightly, studying his friend. David leaned back, letting his gaze drift to the skyline. "If I fire Mark, what message does that send?" David asked. "That I'm here to tear this place apart and rebuild it with no regard for the people who've worked here for years." Eric hesitated, then shrugged. "Maybe, but maybe they need to know you're serious." David smiled faintly. "They'll know," David said, "but I'm not going to break this place just to prove a point. I'm going to show them that Maison Royale can evolve without erasing what came before." Eric exhaled sharply, shaking his head in disbelief. "You're a better man than me." David chuckled. "I'm not better, Eric. I'm just tired." Eric studied him for a long moment before nodding. "All right," Eric said, "but if Mark burns one more dish on purpose, you're letting him go." David laughed softly, raising his glass. "Deal." But as David stared out over the city, he knew the road ahead wouldn't be that simple. Mark wasn't the only challenge. David could feel the weight of Maison Royale's legacy pressing down on him, an invisible force built over decades, reinforced by every person who had walked through its doors believing they were entitled to it. But David wasn't here to inherit someone else's legacy. He was here to build his own. David Monroe knew ghosts when he saw them. Maison Royale was full of them. They didn't linger in the shadows or drift through the empty halls at night. These ghosts lived in the fabric of the place, stitched into the seams of the velvet curtains, pressed into the leather booths, carved along the ornate crown molding that lined the dining room. You could feel them in the hush that followed when David walked into a room, in the way some of the older waitstaff straightened their posture when he passed, as though to remind him and perhaps themselves that he wasn't supposed to be standing there. Maison Royale wasn't haunted by the dead. It was haunted by tradition. The first sign of real trouble came on a Thursday evening. Halfway through dinner service, David sat at a corner table with Eric, quietly observing as guests filtered in. The restaurant wasn't full, but it was busy enough. The usual crowd: men in tailored suits, women in pearl earrings and understated diamonds, murmured over filet mignon and duck confit. David could feel their eyes on him, too polite to stare but too curious to ignore him entirely. Eric leaned in, voice low. "You notice something?" David glanced around the room. "What?" Eric nodded subtly toward the far corner where a table of 4 older white men sat. One of them, a silver-haired banker David recognized from a gala months earlier, gestured toward their waiter, speaking in hushed but urgent tones. The waiter returned moments later with Mark. David's eyes narrowed as he watched Mark exchange a few quiet words with the men, his hands moving in small, deliberate gestures. Finally, Mark disappeared into the kitchen, re-emerging minutes later with a dish David hadn't approved for the evening's menu, one of the classics from before David had taken ownership. David said nothing, but Eric caught the slight shift in his expression. "You see that?" Eric asked, his voice edged with disbelief. "They're cooking off menu now?" David's eyes didn't leave Mark as he moved across the room. "Old habits die hard," David replied, taking a slow sip of his drink. But the simmering heat in his chest told him this was no accident. The confrontation came later that night after the last guests had left. David waited in the empty dining room, seated at the bar as the staff trickled out. Mark lingered by the kitchen door, speaking with 2 sous chefs in hushed tones. When the others had gone, David called his name softly. Mark approached with a practiced calm. "Yes, Mr. Monroe?" David didn't bother to turn toward him. He traced the rim of his glass absently, letting the quiet stretch between them. "I saw what happened tonight," David said finally, his voice smooth but weighted. Mark was silent for a beat too long. "I'm not sure what you mean." David's eyes flicked up, catching Mark's gaze. "The off-menu order. I didn't authorize it." Mark exhaled softly, shifting his stance. "They're regulars. They've been dining here for years. It's what they expect." David's lips pressed together. He wasn't angry, not yet. "I see," David said quietly. "And what do you expect?" "Mark?" Mark hesitated. His gaze shifted toward the front entrance as if considering the fastest way out of the conversation. But David didn't let him off the hook. "I understand loyalty," David continued, his voice steady but firm. "I respect the years you've put into this place. But I need to know if you understand something." Mark's eyes met his again. "I own Maison Royale now," David said, pronouncing each word with the slow precision of someone laying down cards at a table. "That means the traditions that made sense before? They only continue if I say they do." Mark's jaw tightened slightly, but he nodded. "I understand." But David could hear the reservation in his voice. It wasn't an apology. It was an accommodation, one made reluctantly. Like a man stepping aside on the sidewalk, not out of courtesy but because it was easier than bumping shoulders. David didn't press him further. Not yet. Because David knew that the real battle wasn't fought in one conversation. It was fought in the slow erosion of resistance. The steady dismantling of habits that had calcified over decades. The second sign of trouble came a week later. A prominent food critic had been scheduled to visit Maison Royale for a review that could reshape the restaurant's image. David had spent days working with Amara, the new chef he'd brought in, crafting a menu that blended modern flavors with traditional techniques. But when the critic arrived, the dish that landed on his table wasn't from Amara's menu. It was from Mark's. David only found out when he overheard the critic praising the meal during his exit. Later that night, David found Mark alone in the kitchen, wiping down his station. David approached slowly, the hum of the overhead lights filling the space between them. "Mark." Mark glanced up but didn't stop working. "I thought I was clear," David said, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Mark shrugged, setting his rag down. "I did what I thought was best." David took a step closer. his voice quiet but sharp. For who? Mark finally looked at him, really looked at him, and David could see it in his eyes. It wasn't hatred. It was fear. Fear that the place Mark had built his career in was slipping away. Fear that Maison Royale, the sanctuary he had guarded for years, was becoming something unfamiliar. David exhaled softly, running a hand over his jaw. I don't want to fire you, Mark, David said, and he meant it, but I can't run this place with one hand on the wheel and you yanking it in the other direction. Mark's shoulders stiffened. For a moment, David thought he might argue. Instead, Mark nodded, slow, reluctant. I hear you, Mark said, but David wondered if he truly did. As David left the kitchen that night, he felt the weight of something heavier than tradition pressing down on him. It wasn't just Mark. It was the ghosts, the ones that had been sitting at the tables long before David ever walked through the door. David Monroe believed in patience. But patience, he found, was a fragile thing, something that chipped away slowly, until all that remained was the raw edge of resolve. The critics' review landed in the Times 3 days later. It praised Maison Royale's commitment to tradition and refusal to bend to fleeting culinary trends. David read the review at his desk, his fingers drumming softly against the mahogany surface. The words felt like a slap delivered with a velvet glove. Commitment to tradition. A polite way of saying nothing has changed. Eric was less reserved when he read the article. I swear, Eric muttered, tossing the paper onto David's desk. Mark's doing this on purpose. David folded the paper carefully, setting it aside. I know. So fire him. David leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing slightly as he stared out the window. From the penthouse, the city stretched out beneath him, a glittering expanse of light and movement. That's exactly what he wants, David said quietly. If I fire Mark, it proves his point. Eric frowned. And what point is that? David's gaze didn't leave the skyline. That I don't belong here. That I came in, disrupted everything, and tore down the house because I couldn't understand how to live in it. Eric exhaled sharply, pacing the office. You can't run a business looking over your shoulder. David, these people don't need reasons to doubt you, they'll invent them if you don't give them one. David finally looked at his friend, and there was something hard in his expression. I'm not tearing this place down, David said. I'm going to make them see it differently. Eric raised an eyebrow but said nothing more. David could feel it, the thin veil that separated him from the staff, from the clientele, from the very walls of Maison Royale. It was the kind of veil that pretended to be transparent but was woven thick with generations of expectation and quiet exclusion. It wasn't enough to own the restaurant. He had to reshape it in a way that made them uncomfortable. The change started in the smallest of ways. First, David instructed Amara to take charge of the lunch menu, low stakes, where regulars rarely dined but foot traffic from the office crowd flowed steadily. She introduced bold flavors, West African spices blended with French techniques, dishes that carried the imprint of both continents, both histories. The shift was subtle, but noticeable. Some guests embraced it immediately. Others didn't bother to hide their displeasure. One afternoon, David overheard an older couple complaining to their waiter. This isn't how it's supposed to taste, the man grumbled, pushing his plate aside. Maison Royale never served anything like this before. David, seated 2 tables away, took a long sip of his espresso but didn't intervene. The veil was thinning, but not everyone appreciated the shift. Mark grew colder by the day. His demeanor was polite, professional, but distant. David caught him slipping old dishes back onto the menu, small acts of rebellion disguised as nostalgia. One evening, David entered the kitchen unannounced to find Mark guiding 2 young chefs through a sauce David had explicitly removed from the offerings. The room fell silent as David approached. Evening, David said softly, his eyes locking with Mark's. Mark wiped his hands on a kitchen towel, his expression unreadable. I thought it might be worth keeping, Mark said casually, gesturing to the sauce. It's a guest favorite. David stepped closer, resting his hands against the edge of the counter. Which guest? David asked. Mark hesitated, but only briefly. The ones who've been coming here longer than you've been alive. The words hung in the air like smoke. David smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. That may be true, David said, but I didn't buy this place to cook for ghosts. The younger chefs exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to stay or leave. David nodded toward the sauce. Take it off the line, David said, his voice quiet but firm. We're moving forward, not backward. Mark held his gaze for a long moment. Finally, he nodded. Of course, Mr. Monroe. But David knew that was not the end of it. The final breach came 2 weeks later during an invite-only tasting event. David had invited investors, media, and key figures from the industry, faces that could redefine Maison Royale's reputation with the stroke of a pen or the swipe of a credit card. The menu, crafted by Amara, was ambitious. Each dish told a story, a fusion of French technique with the boldness of African and Caribbean flavors. But halfway through the event, David noticed something odd. 2 tables in the back received different plates. Smaller portions. Traditional French cuisine. David excused himself from the main floor and walked into the kitchen. Mark stood at the line, plating the off-menu dishes with meticulous care. David didn't stop walking until he stood across from him. Mark didn't look up. Busy right now, David. David's voice didn't rise, but it hardened. Who are those for? Mark glanced at him, then at the dining room. Old friends, Mark said. Thought they'd appreciate something familiar. David nodded slowly, letting the silence sit between them like a weight pressing down on the room. Then, softly but clearly, David said, "You're done here." Mark's hands froze mid-motion. What? David stepped closer, his voice low enough that no one else could hear. I said you're done. Tonight is your last service. Mark's jaw tightened, but David saw the flicker of disbelief behind his eyes. This place, Mark began, but David cut him off. This place, David said, isn't yours anymore, and if you can't respect that, you don't belong here. Mark stared at him for a long moment, something unreadable in his expression. But David didn't waver. Mark set the plate down carefully, wiped his hands, and walked out. Later that night, David stood alone in the dining room, running his hand along the smooth surface of the bar. The ghosts were still there, lingering quietly in the corners. But they didn't feel as heavy now. David could feel the shift, the thin veil tearing just enough to let something new seep through. Maison Royale wasn't free of its past. But for the first time, David felt like it was his. David Monroe had not expected silence to be so loud. Mark's absence hung over Maison Royale like the faint hum of a refrigerator in an empty house, constant, but easy to ignore until the quiet pressed too hard against the walls. The staff moved briskly, efficiently, but their eyes betrayed them. They flickered toward the kitchen doors when David entered the dining room, lingering a second too long, as if expecting Mark to emerge and take his rightful place behind the line. But Mark wasn't coming back. David knew the difference between firing a man and removing a pillar. When you let go of someone like Mark, the foundation didn't crumble immediately. It cracked slowly, one hairline fracture at a time. David could feel it. At first, it was subtle, an overcooked steak here, a forgotten garnish there, small things, easy to dismiss as mistakes. But by the 3rd week, David recognized what was happening. Mark hadn't taken the old guard with him when he left. He'd left them behind. Quiet soldiers armed not with outright rebellion but with the slow erosion of precision. It was sabotage by 1,000 cuts. Eric noticed it before David was ready to admit it. You know what they're doing, right? Eric said one evening, leaning against the bar as David reviewed invoices. David didn't look up. I know. Eric's brow furrowed. And? David set the papers down carefully, smoothing them with his hand. And I'm not firing half the staff. If that's what you're suggesting. Eric's voice dropped, low enough that the bartender polishing glasses wouldn't overhear. David, they're testing you. If you let them keep doing this, it's going to bleed into the floor. One bad review, one article about the decline of Maison Royale. I know, David repeated, but this time there was steel in his voice. Eric studied him, searching for the edge of doubt. When he found none, he sighed and leaned back. All right, Eric said, raising his hands in mock surrender. But don't say I didn't warn you when the soufflé collapses mid-service. David let the moment hang, the quiet between them thick with unspoken understanding. Eric wasn't wrong, but David wasn't ready to lose more pieces of the house before the scaffolding was even in place. One night, it finally cracked. A Friday, full house. David was in his office, reviewing blueprints for the small lounge he planned to add upstairs, a place for live jazz. Something that spoke more to his roots than the cold, sterile quiet of the dining room. He didn't hear the shouting at first. It wasn't until he stepped out into the hallway that the sound caught him, voices rising from the kitchen. Sharp and fast like knives thrown in the dark. When David pushed open the kitchen doors, the room fell abruptly silent. The staff parted just enough for David to see Amara standing near the plating station. Her hands clenched at her sides. Across from her, sous chef Matthew, one of Mark's old protégés. Matthew's eyes flicked to David and, for a moment, David saw the regret in them. But it was too late to reel the words back in. "What's going on?" David's voice was low, but it cut through the room like glass underfoot. Amara opened her mouth, but Matthew spoke first. "She changed the sauce," he said, and there was something brittle in his tone. David's gaze shifted to Amara. "I adjusted the reduction," she said calmly, though David could see the tension running through her shoulders. The dish was too rich, it needed acidity to balance it. David nodded slowly. "I'd trust her judgment." Matthew hesitated, and David saw it again, that flicker of disbelief. Not at the sauce. At the fact that a black woman now held the title of head chef in a kitchen Mark used to run. "It's not about the sauce," Matthew muttered, shaking his head. "This place isn't the same anymore." David's voice didn't rise, but it sharpened. "No," David agreed, stepping forward. "It's not." The words settled over the kitchen like ash. Matthew didn't argue. He untied his apron, folded it neatly, and set it on the counter before walking out. David watched him go. No one else moved. When the door swung shut behind Matthew, David turned to the rest of the staff. "If anyone else feels the same way," David said, his gaze sweeping the room, "you can leave now. No hard feelings." No one moved. "Good," David said quietly. "Now get back to work." That night, David stayed long after the last guest had gone, walking the empty floor of Maison Royale in silence. The kitchen doors creaked softly behind him, and David turned to see Amara approaching, her chef's jacket slung over one shoulder. "You didn't have to do that," she said, folding her arms. "I could have handled Matthew." David smiled faintly. "I know, but I needed them to hear it from me." Amara's eyes narrowed slightly. "You think this is over?" David glanced around the room, the weight of it pressing down on him. "No," he admitted, "but it's a start." Amara nodded once, lingering for a moment before heading toward the exit. David stayed behind, staring out the window at the streetlights beyond the glass. The ghosts were still there. But now, David thought, maybe they were starting to listen. The first cracks in the glass are hard to see, thin as hairlines. Almost imperceptible, but David Monroe knew enough about fractures to recognize when they were beginning to spread. It wasn't Matthew's departure that unsettled David. Men like Matthew rarely stayed when the winds change. What lingered was the silence that followed. The kitchen, once buzzing with the quiet harmony of moving parts, now felt like it held its breath each time David walked through. The fracture hadn't broken wide open yet, but David could hear it deep beneath the surface, creaking like ice underfoot. It happened 3 nights later. David arrived at Maison Royale early, long before the evening crowd. The dining room lay still in the morning light, the empty tables waiting like unoccupied pews. He walked the length of the floor, pausing by each table, running his hand along the smooth surface of the linens. He imagined the faces that would fill the space later that night, some familiar. Others stepping through those doors for the first time. He was beginning to believe in the vision again. Then the phone rang. It was Eric. "David, you need to get down here." David's grip tightened around the receiver. "I'm already at the restaurant." "No," Eric said, and his voice was grim. "The suppliers, David, they're pulling out." The words hit like cold water to the chest. David felt his body stiffen. "I'll handle it," David said. "I don't think you understand." Eric pressed. "It's not just 1 or 2. It's all of them. Meat, produce, wine. I called around, and someone's been talking. They're freezing you out." David's silence stretched too long. Finally, he exhaled. "All right," he said, "let me make some calls." David spent the rest of the afternoon in his office. The responses were the same, polite, clipped, apologetic. "I'm sorry, Mr. Monroe, we're just restructuring our distribution right now." "Maison Royale? We've had some logistical issues with your orders." "It's nothing personal." But David knew better. There was always a thin veil between what people said and what they meant. And this was the language of men who believed their silence carried more weight than their words. It wasn't the first time David had been shut out of something he thought he'd earned. He remembered being 16, applying for an internship at a local computer repair shop. The owner, a broad-shouldered man with thick-rimmed glasses, smiled too wide when David asked for the application. "We'll give you a call," the man had said, but the call never came. And now, decades later, it was happening again, just dressed in finer suits and linen napkins. That evening, David stood by the bar, watching the dining room fill slowly. The guests arrived in pairs, their shoes clicking softly against the marble floor. A few regulars greeted David with polite nods as they passed. Eric slid in beside him. "Any luck?" Eric asked, his voice low. "Not yet," David replied. Eric let out a slow breath. Leaning against the bar. "They're trying to squeeze you out." David nodded faintly. "I know." Eric's gaze lingered on the floor, watching as servers moved between tables. "You should call Philippe," Eric suggested. "Let him deal with his old friends." David's eyes narrowed slightly. "I didn't buy this place to ask Philippe LaSalle for favors." Eric let out a dry laugh. "No, I suppose you didn't." For a moment, the two men stood in silence, watching the restaurant come to life around them. Then David straightened. "If they want to squeeze me out," David said softly, "they'll have to try harder than this." Eric raised an eyebrow. "What's the plan?" David's gaze swept across the room, taking in every face, every table. "We'll source somewhere else," David said. "I'll bring in smaller suppliers, the ones these old guys don't know or trust." Eric smiled faintly. "You're going to turn this place into the Underground Railroad of fine dining." David chuckled under his breath. "Something like that." By the end of the week, the first new shipment arrived. David stood by the loading dock, watching as crates of fresh produce were unloaded by hand, no middlemen. No corporate logos, just small farmers, family-run vineyards, and artisans who didn't answer to the same power circles. Amara met him by the kitchen entrance, arms folded. "This isn't going to sit well with the regulars," she warned. David smiled faintly. "It's not supposed to." Amara studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Good," she said. "I'll get to work." That night, Maison Royale served something new. Gone were the heavy, traditional French dishes that had anchored the restaurant for decades. In their place, spiced lamb with pomegranate glaze, citrus-crusted sea bass, charred okra with saffron aioli. The regulars noticed. David could see the hesitation in their eyes as the plates arrived. Some whispered to each other, unsure of the unfamiliar flavors. But as the evening wore on, something shifted. Laughter echoed from the far corner, where a younger couple shared dessert. A group of tourists asked for second helpings. By the time the last guests left, David stood at the doorway, shaking hands and exchanging farewells. A few regulars left without comment, but David didn't miss the subtle nods of approval from others. The glass hadn't broken yet, but the fractures were spreading, and David Monroe, patient as ever, was ready to watch it shatter.